The morning air was sharp enough to sting the lungs, each breath escaping as a thin cloud that vanished almost instantly in the February cold. Providence had a way of making winter feel personal, as though the wind itself was in on some private grudge against those who dared to walk its streets. Carrie Hopkins pulled her coat tighter around her small frame as she stepped off the bus, the strap of her worn leather purse digging into her shoulder. That purse had been a gift from her mother when she'd first started college, back when the idea of finishing her degree still felt like a straight path instead of the uncertain road it had become. Inside the bag was a folded slip of paper, one that should have weighed almost nothing but instead felt as heavy as a brick: parking violation, emergency conditions, the words stamped in bold black ink that seemed to glare at her through the fold. For many, such a ticket might have been an inconvenience, a passing irritation to deal with and forget. For Carrie, it was one more in a long chain of burdens that seemed to grow heavier by the week. She was 22 years old, trying to balance her studies at Rhode Island College with long evening shifts at a small cafe, her life dictated by the ebb and flow of low paychecks and rising bills. Only last week, she had been forced to withdraw from one of her classes, a decision that instantly stripped her of her full-time student status and put her scholarship in jeopardy. Without that scholarship, the question of how she would pay for the coming semester loomed over her like a shadow she couldn't outrun. Her bank account told the rest of the story: numbers that dipped dangerously close to zero, overdraft notices arriving like clockwork, the constant calculation of what could be skipped in order to make rent. Lunch breaks often became an hour spent nursing a single cup of coffee, avoiding the temptation of the pastry case she spent her evenings refilling for customers. And now, this ticket. Not just the fine, but the $225 she had already been forced to pay to get her car back from the tow yard. It was a sum that represented her entire grocery budget for the week, gone in an instant. The chain of events had begun the night before, under the dim light of street lamps and the distant promise of snow. Carrie had been at her friend Megan's apartment, an old building with creaky floors and a radiator that wheezed and clanked as it struggled to fight the chill. They had been preparing for an upcoming exam, the table crowded with open textbooks, pens scattered like fallen twigs, and the warm, herbal scent of tea lingering in the air. At some point during the night, Carrie's phone had buzzed, a message from her mother warning her that snow was on the way. It had seemed harmless enough at the time. The weather forecast spoke only of light flurries, maybe an inch at most. Megan's apartment had no driveway, and the small parking lot out back was already filled. Carrie could have driven across town to her own apartment, but it was late, and the thought of scraping ice from the windshield in the dark was enough to convince her to leave her car parked on the street for the night. It was a small decision, the kind people make without a second thought, until it isn't. At 4 a.m, the low growl of a heavy engine broke through the quiet. At first, it might have been easy to mistake it for a snowplow, but then came the metallic clink of chains and the slow, deliberate thud of something being pulled taut. When Carrie dragged herself to the frosted window, the sight was already set in motion, her old silver Honda Civic being winched onto the back of a tow truck. There was no conversation, no warning, just the cold efficiency of a process that had played out countless times before for countless other cars. By the time she had thrown on her jacket and stumbled down the stairs, the truck was already pulling away, the glow of its red taillights shrinking until they disappeared into the snowy dark. The snow itself didn't last long. By morning, it had stopped entirely, leaving only a thin, patchy covering along the edges of the sidewalks, as though mocking the idea that any real storm had passed through. Retrieving her car meant a trip to Thurbaz Avenue, where the tow yard squatted behind a tall chain-link fence topped with rusted barbed wire. The air inside the cramped office smelled faintly of burnt coffee, the kind left sitting too long on a hot plate. Behind the counter sat a man who barely glanced up from the glow of his phone. When Carrie gave her name, he tapped at his keyboard with the slow disinterest of someone who had done this too many times before, announcing the amount owed without a hint of hesitation. $225. Pay now, or pay more tomorrow when storage fees were added. She asked if there was any way to reduce the cost, explaining she was a student, that she didn't know about the emergency parking rules that night. He didn't blink. If she wanted a break, he said, she could go talk to a judge. Here, she was paying the full amount. And so she did. She handed over her debit card, feeling the weight of the transaction not just in her wallet but in her chest. Outside, the cold seemed sharper, the sky a pale, unforgiving gray. The courtroom was warmer but no less intimidating. The scent of varnished wood and fresh coffee hung in the air, and the benches were lined with people holding papers and envelopes, their faces a mixture of frustration, anxiety, and resignation. Carrie took her place among them, clutching her folded ticket like a talisman she wasn't sure could protect her. When her name was called, she stepped forward, trying to keep her breathing steady. The judge listened as she explained what had happened, how her parents had mentioned the possibility of snow, how she had been at her friend's apartment with no available parking, how she had assumed leaving the car on the street for one night would be harmless. She recounted the early morning tow, the trip to the yard, the curt exchange with the man behind the counter. The judge, known for his ability to read people, studied her as she spoke. Her story lacked embellishment, it was plain and unpolished, the kind of truth that doesn't always come out cleanly. She spoke with the hesitance of someone unused to pleading their case, someone aware that the decision rested entirely in the hands of another. There was no anger in her voice, just a tired resignation and a quiet hope that perhaps the fine could be eased. He asked a few questions, clarifying details, how she'd learned about the snow, whether she had any other place to park, whether the tow company had given her any sort of discount. She answered honestly, each admission carrying the same threadbare tone. No, she hadn't known it was an official emergency. No, she hadn't had anywhere else to put the car. No, the tow company had charged her the full amount without hesitation. After a pause, the judge leaned back in his chair, his expression softening just slightly. He remarked that the tow itself was punishment enough, and that the $225 she had already paid was a significant penalty for someone in her position. The ticket, he decided, would be dismissed. Relief washed over her in a quiet wave. There was no dramatic outburst, no visible unraveling, just the subtle drop of her shoulders and a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She thanked him and stepped away from the podium, the paper in her purse now just a reminder of what had almost been worse. Outside, the winter sun was pale but bright, glinting off the damp patches where snow had already melted into the gutter. The air still bit at her cheeks, but it no longer felt hostile. For the first time in weeks, she felt as though the weight on her chest had lightened, even if only a little. Sometimes, the smallest act of understanding could make all the difference. If you believe kindness still has a place in the world, if you think that listening before judging can soften the hardest days, share this story. And if you want to hear more moments where compassion turns strangers into something closer to neighbors, join us at Kindness Kingdom. Because a little humanity can go further than you think.